The fog, a greasy shroud, clung to the cobbled streets of London, 1879. Gas lamps flickered with a weak, jaundiced light, barely piercing the oppressive gloom that had settled over Dorset Street. In the heart of this labyrinthine network of alleyways and shadowed buildings stood a modest, two-story dwelling, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the night. It was within these walls that the peculiar and unsettling story of the Marrow Twins began to unfold. Elias and Silas Marrow were the subject of hushed whispers and furtive glances in the neighborhood. They were identical, down to the mole on Elias's left cheek and the slight tremor in Silas's right hand. But it was not their physical similarity that drew attention. It was their claim, a chilling assertion whispered amongst themselves and occasionally to bewildered onlookers, that they were, in fact, the same person. Two bodies, Elias would often say, his voice a low, resonant murmur, but a single soul. Silas would nod in silent agreement, his pale eyes mirroring his brother's unsettling conviction. Their small abode was sparsely furnished, reflecting a life of quiet austerity. Books lined one wall of the main room, volumes on philosophy, psychology, and the darker aspects of human nature. The air within was often thick with the scent of pipe tobacco and the faint metallic tang of ink, remnants of their shared intellectual pursuits and late-night discussions. They were both avid readers and writers, though their works, much like their lives, remained largely unseen by the outside world. The unsettling nature of their claim was compounded by their increasingly erratic behavior. Neighbors reported seeing them move in perfect synchronicity, completing each other's sentences, and reacting to unseen stimuli as if connected by an invisible thread. Children would cross the street to avoid their gaze, and even the hardened residents of Dorset Street, accustomed to the city's grim realities, found the Marrow Twins to be uniquely disquieting. One particularly foggy evening, a local constable, Officer Davies, was called to their residence. A concerned landlady, Mrs. Gable, had reported strange noises emanating from their rooms, muffled cries, heavy thuds, and what sounded like frantic whispering. Davies, a stout man with a weathered face and a skeptical disposition, had dismissed it initially as mere domestic squabble. But Mrs. Gable's persistent unease had finally prompted him to investigate. He knocked on the door, the sound swallowed by the fog. After a long, unnerving silence, the door creaked open, revealing Elias standing in the dim light. His face was pale, and shadows danced in the depths of his eyes. "Officer," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we were not expecting company." Davies stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the room. Silas stood by the window, his back to them, seemingly lost in contemplation of the fog-laden street below. The air was heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. "Mrs. Gable reported some disturbances," Davies said, his tone cautious. "Everything all right here, gentlemen?" Elias offered a weak smile. "Perfectly all right, officer. Just engaging in a rather vigorous intellectual debate." But Davies's eyes were drawn to a dark stain on the wooden floor near the fireplace. It was still damp, and the coppery scent of blood hung faintly in the air. "What is that?" Davies asked, his voice hardening. Silas turned slowly from the window. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the constable with an unnerving intensity. "That, officer," Silas said, his voice a chilling echo of Elias's, "is where our experiment began. Please subscribe to the channel for the next chapter of the dreadful history of the Marrow Twins. This is a work of fiction." The word experiment hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Officer Davies's hand instinctively moved towards the truncheon at his belt. The stain on the floor pulsed darkly in the flickering gaslight, a silent testament to something untoward. "Experiment?" Davies repeated, his gaze shifting between the two brothers. "What sort of experiment requires that?" He gestured towards the stain with a nod of his head. Elias's pale face grew even whiter. He wrung his hands nervously, his eyes darting towards Silas, as if seeking guidance. Silas, however, remained unnervingly calm, his gaze unwavering. "It was a physiological investigation," Silas began, his voice measured and devoid of emotion. "We sought to understand the limits of the human form, the resilience of the vessel." Davies frowned, his skepticism deepening. "And this investigation involved blood." Before either twin could answer, a muffled sob echoed from the room upstairs. Davies's head snapped towards the ceiling. "What was that?" he demanded. Elias and Silas exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance. "It was nothing, officer," Elias stammered. "Just the wind." But Davies was not convinced. He moved towards the staircase. "I'll be the judge of that." Elias tried to block his path, his demeanor suddenly more agitated. "Please, officer, it's private. We assure you, everything is under control." Davies pushed past him, his suspicion now fully aroused. He ascended the creaking wooden stairs, his senses on high alert. The air grew colder as he climbed, and the muffled sounds from above became more distinct. Weeping, punctuated by low moans. He reached the landing and found a closed door at the end of the hallway. Hesitantly, he pushed it open. The scene that greeted him sent a chill down his spine. A young man lay bound to a chair in the center of the room, his face bruised and bloodied, his eyes wide with terror, locked onto Davies. "Help me," the young man croaked, his voice hoarse with fear. "They're mad." Elias and Silas appeared in the doorway behind Davies, their expressions now devoid of any pretense of innocence. A strange, almost triumphant glint shone in their eyes. "Ah, Thomas," Silas said, his voice soft but laced with a chilling undertone. "We were just about to continue our studies." Davies's mind raced. He had stumbled upon something far more sinister than a simple disturbance. These were not just eccentric twins, they were dangerous. "Release him," Davies commanded, his hand now firmly on his truncheon. The twins did not move. Elias's lips curved into a thin, unsettling smile. "But you see, officer," he said, "Thomas is a vital component of our experiment. We are so close to understanding ourselves." "Ourselves?" Davies questioned, his confusion momentarily eclipsing his apprehension. Silas stepped forward, his gaze intense. "Yes, officer. We told you. We are the same person. And Thomas is helping us prove it." The young man in the chair whimpered, his eyes pleading with Davies. The constable knew he had to act quickly. He lunged towards the twins, but they moved with a speed that belied their seemingly frail frames. A struggle ensued in the cramped hallway. Davies, though stronger, was hampered by the narrow space and the unsettling coordination between the brothers. They seemed to anticipate his every move, their actions strangely synchronized. During the scuffle, a heavy book fell from a nearby shelf, landing open on the floor. Davies caught a fleeting glimpse of the title, The Anatomy of Duality. Before he could fully process the significance of the book, a sharp blow to the back of his head sent him crashing to the floor. Darkness enveloped him. Davies's head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. His vision swam in and out of focus. He lay on the cold wooden floor of the upstairs room, his limbs bound tightly with rope. The young man, Thomas, remained tied to the chair, his face pale and streaked with tears. The Marrow twins stood over them, their expressions a disturbing blend of scientific curiosity and detached cruelty. Elias held a bloodied cloth in his hand, while Silas examined a series of strange instruments laid out on a nearby table, scalpels, needles, and devices Davies could not readily identify. "Our apologies, officer," Silas said, his voice almost apologetic. "But you became an impediment to our progress." Elias chuckled softly. "Indeed. but perhaps your presence can still be of some use. Our hypothesis requires further verification. Davies struggled against his bonds, his fear giving way to a surge of anger. "You're insane," he spat. "This has to stop." Silas sighed as if dealing with a petulant child. "Insanity is merely a label applied to those who perceive reality differently, officer. We see the truth, a truth that eludes the common man. The boundaries of individuality are an illusion. We are proving that." "By torturing innocent people?" Davies retorted. "Torture is a crude term for scientific inquiry," Elias interjected. "We are merely observing the interconnectedness of human experience. Thomas here has been instrumental in demonstrating the shared capacity for pain, for fear." Thomas whimpered again, his eyes darting between the twins and the bound constable. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" Davies asked, his voice strained. "We believe that the sensation of pain, the emotional response to trauma, is not confined to a single consciousness when two bodies are intrinsically linked," Silas explained, his eyes gleaming with a fanatical light. "We theorize that a profound connection, such as ours, allows for a shared experience of suffering." "You inflict pain on him," Davies said, his voice tight with disgust. "And you believe you feel it too?" Elias nodded eagerly. "Precisely, and we have begun to observe other shared sensations, memories, fleeting thoughts. The lines are blurring, officer. The singularity is within reach." Davies felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The twins' twisted logic was both horrifying and unsettling. They genuinely believed their delusional claims, and they were willing to inflict unimaginable suffering to validate them. "And what was the blood on the floor downstairs?" Davies asked, his mind desperately searching for a way to understand their actions. Silas's gaze turned distant. "That was a preliminary exploration. We sought to understand the physical limits, the point at which one vessel's distress would manifest in the other. It was inconclusive." The instruments on the table glinted menacingly in the dim light. Davies knew he was in grave danger. He had to find a way to escape, not just for himself, but for the terrified young man bound beside him. "Your theory is flawed," Davies said, hoping to sow a seed of doubt in their minds. "You are two separate individuals, perpetrating a monstrous act of violence." Elias laughed, a high-pitched, unsettling sound. "Denial is a common reaction to the unveiling of profound truths, officer. But the evidence is mounting. Soon, we will have irrefutable proof." Just then, a sharp rapping sound echoed from downstairs. The twins froze, their eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Who could that be?" Elias murmured. Silas moved cautiously towards the door. "Stay here," he instructed Elias. Silas crept downstairs, leaving Elias to watch over Davies and Thomas. The constable seized the opportunity, subtly testing the strength of his bonds. They were tight, but not impossible. From downstairs, Davies could hear the muffled sound of Silas opening the front door. A woman's voice, sharp and demanding, cut through the silence. "I demand to know what's going on in there." The noises. "And Officer Davies hasn't returned." It was Mrs. Gable, the landlady, her concern evidently outweighing her fear. Silas's voice, strained and unnatural, replied, "Everything is fine, Mrs. Gable. The officer has left. You must have been mistaken about the noises." But Mrs. Gable was not easily dissuaded. "I heard screams, Mr. Marrow, and that young man, Thomas, I haven't seen him in days. I'm going to call the authorities." Panic flickered across Elias's face upstairs. He turned to Davies, his eyes wild. "This is your fault." Elias's accusation hung in the tense air. Downstairs, Mrs. Gable's determined voice could still be faintly heard through the floorboards, a looming threat to the twins' carefully constructed facade. "What are you going to do?" Davies asked, his voice deceptively calm as he continued to subtly work at the ropes binding his wrists. Elias paced the small room, his agitation evident. "She can't call the authorities. They can't find out." He trailed off, his eyes darting nervously towards Thomas, who remained a silent, terrified witness. Just then, Silas reappeared in the doorway, his face a mask of strained composure. "She's gone for now," he said, his voice low. "But she's suspicious. We need to move quickly." "Move where?" Elias asked, his voice laced with desperation. "Somewhere they won't find us," Silas replied, his gaze sweeping over the room as if searching for an escape route. "Somewhere we can continue our work without interruption." Davies saw a flicker of opportunity. The twins were clearly rattled, their carefully planned experiment threatened by external forces. "You won't get away with this," Davies said, his voice firm despite his predicament. "The truth will come out." Silas's eyes narrowed. "The truth is what we are striving to uncover, officer, and we will not let anyone stand in our way." He turned his attention back to the instruments on the table, his focus seemingly returning to their macabre endeavor. Elias, however, remained visibly unnerved. "What if she comes back with the police?" Elias whispered. "Then we will have to deal with them," Silas said, his tone cold and resolute. He picked up a long, thin needle, its point glinting in the lamplight. Davies' heart pounded in his chest. He knew that dealing with them could only mean more violence. He had to act, and act now. Taking a deep breath, he made a sudden, forceful movement with his arms, straining against the ropes. The rough fibers bit into his skin, but one of the knots loosened slightly. He repeated the motion again and again, his muscles screaming in protest. Upstairs, the tension was palpable. Thomas watched the scene unfold with wide, fearful eyes, while Elias nervously watched the window, as if expecting the authorities to burst through at any moment. Silas, engrossed in his preparations, seemed oblivious to Davies's efforts. Finally, with a sharp tug, one of Davies's hands came free. He kept his movements small and concealed, working quickly to untie the remaining bonds. Once his hands were free, he silently mouthed to Thomas to remain still. He then waited for the opportune moment. Silas turned back towards them, the needle in his hand. "Now, Thomas," he said, his voice disturbingly calm, "we will explore the correlation between physical trauma and—" Before Silas could finish his sentence, Davies lunged forward, knocking the table with the instruments over with a crash. Scalpels and needles scattered across the floor. The sudden movement startled both twins. Elias gasped, while Silas whirled around, his eyes wide with surprise and anger. Davies, though still stiff from being bound, tackled Elias, pushing him against the wall. Elias cried out in pain. Silas, momentarily stunned, reacted quickly. He lunged towards Davies, the needle still clutched in his hand. A chaotic struggle ensued. Davies, fueled by adrenaline and desperation, fought with a ferocity born of necessity. He managed to disarm Silas, sending the needle clattering across the floor. During the fight, Davies noticed a heavy candlestick on a nearby shelf. He reached for it, his fingers closing around the cold metal. Just as Silas lunged again, Davies swung the candlestick with all his might, striking Silas on the side of the head. Silas staggered back, a look of disbelief on his face, before collapsing to the floor. Elias, seeing his brother fall, let out a cry of rage and lunged at Davies. But Davies was ready. He sidestepped Elias's attack and delivered a sharp blow to his jaw, sending him sprawling beside his unconscious twin. Davies quickly untied Thomas, who was trembling but unharmed. "We need to get out of here," Davies said urgently. Just as they reached the top of the stairs, they heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the street below, followed by a loud knock on the front door. "Police!" a voice shouted. "Open up!" Davies and Thomas exchanged relieved glances. Mrs. Gable had indeed called the authorities. Please subscribe to the channel for the next chapter of the dreadful history of the Marrow Twins. This is a work of fiction. The arrival of the police was a welcome relief, a beacon of order cutting through the suffocating darkness that had enveloped the house. Officer Davies, though bruised and shaken, quickly explained the horrifying events that had transpired upstairs. Mrs. Gable, her face etched with a mixture of fear and vindication, corroborated his account, detailing the strange noises and her growing unease. The constables, initially skeptical of the landlady's claims, were quickly convinced by the sight of the bound Thomas and the unconscious Marrow twins. Elias and Silas were promptly apprehended and taken into custody, their bizarre claims of shared consciousness falling on the deaf ears of the law. Thomas, though traumatized by his ordeal, was released into the care of his relieved family. Davies, after providing a detailed statement, was advised to seek medical attention for his injuries. However, despite the apparent resolution of the immediate crisis, a sense of unease lingered in Davies's mind. The twins' unsettling pronouncements and their almost unnerving synchronicity during the struggle continued to gnaw at him. Their conviction, however delusional, had been disturbingly profound. Days turned into weeks. The Marrow Twins became a sensational story in the London newspapers, their dreadful history dissected and sensationalized for public consumption. They were portrayed as madmen, dangerous eccentrics whose perverse experiment had ended in violence and capture. Davies followed the news reports with a grim fascination. He learned more about the twins' reclusive life, their intense intellectual pursuits, and their growing obsession with the concept of duality and interconnectedness. Their writings, discovered in their cluttered home, spoke of blurring boundaries, shared experiences, and the desire to transcend the limitations of individual identity. One rainy afternoon, Davies found himself drawn back to Dorset Street. He stood across from the now shuttered house, its windows dark and lifeless. The fog, a familiar presence in this part of London, swirled around him, whispering forgotten secrets. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the Marrow Twins' story than what had been revealed. Their claim to be the same person, however outlandish, had been uttered with such unwavering conviction. Had it been merely a symptom of their madness? Or was there something more to it? Driven by a persistent unease, Davies decided to delve deeper. He visited the local library, poring over articles and pamphlets related to psychology, philosophy, and unusual medical cases. He sought out any mention of individuals exhibiting similar beliefs or behaviors. His research led him down a rabbit hole of obscure theories and forgotten studies. He discovered historical accounts of conjoined twins who claimed to share thoughts and feelings, and philosophical debates about the nature of consciousness and identity. One particularly intriguing article detailed the case of a pair of twins who, despite being physically separate, exhibited an uncanny ability to anticipate each other's actions and even experience similar physical sensations at the same time. While the article offered no definitive explanation, it hinted at a deeper, perhaps inexplicable connection between certain individuals. Davies also learned that the Marrow Twins had been the subject of local rumors for years, whispers of strange rituals and secretive experiments conducted within the walls of their home. Some neighbors claimed to have seen them engaging in bizarre practices in the dead of night, their silhouettes moving in perfect unison behind the drawn curtains. The more Davies learned, the more perplexed he became. He couldn't reconcile the twins' seemingly deranged beliefs with their meticulous planning and their intense intellectual engagement with complex philosophical concepts. Were they simply mad? Or was there a twisted logic to their claims? His investigation took him to the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, the infamous Bedlam, where the Marrow Twins were now confined. He sought permission to speak with them, hoping to gain some insight into their minds. After several requests, his petition was finally granted. He was led to a stark, dimly lit room where Elias sat alone. his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Silas was deemed too volatile for an interview. Elias was gaunt and pale, his former intensity replaced by a vacant listlessness. He barely acknowledged Davies's presence. "Mr. Marrow," Davies began, his voice gentle. "I'm Officer Davies. I was at your home." Elias's eyes flickered briefly, a spark of recognition in their depths. Then they returned to their empty stare. "He's gone," Elias murmured, his voice barely audible. "Who is gone, Mr. Marrow?" Davies asked patiently. "Silas," Elias whispered. He left." Davies frowned. "But your brother is here, in the hospital." Elias shook his head slowly. "No, he's not here. He's somewhere else." His words were cryptic and unsettling, offering no clear answers. Davies tried to press him further, but Elias retreated into silence, his mind seemingly lost in a fog of his own making. Davies left the hospital feeling more confused than ever. Elias's words hinted at a separation, a departure of some kind. But what could it mean? The mystery of the Marrow Twins deepened, leaving Davies with a gnawing sense that the true horror of their story had yet to be fully revealed. Driven by Elias's cryptic words and the lingering unease surrounding the Marrow Twins, Davies continued his informal investigation. He revisited the twins' home, which remained sealed but under occasional police surveillance. He spoke again with Mrs. Gable, who, though still shaken, offered a few more fragmented details about the twins' strange habits. She recalled instances of only one twin being seen leaving the house for days at a time, only to be replaced by the other, with no explanation. She also mentioned hearing them arguing in hushed tones, sometimes seemingly with themselves, referring to each other by name even when alone. These details, combined with Elias's pronouncement that Silas was gone, fueled Davies's growing suspicion that the twins' delusion of shared identity might have been more complex and perhaps even more disturbing than initially believed. He decided to focus on their writings, the journals and manuscripts discovered in their home. Gaining access to these proved difficult, as they were considered evidence in an ongoing inquiry. However, through a contact at Scotland Yard who had been intrigued by Davies's persistent questions, he managed to obtain copies of some excerpts. The writings were dense and often rambling, filled with philosophical musings on the nature of self, consciousness, and the perceived limitations of individuality. They detailed their experiments in increasingly disturbing detail, hinting at self-inflicted pain and sensory deprivation, all in the pursuit of blurring the lines between them. One recurring theme in their journals was the idea of a dominant and a subservient self within their shared identity. They wrote of periods where one felt more in control, more present, while the other receded into a shadowy background. This concept resonated with Mrs. Gable's recollections of seeing only one twin at a time. One entry, written in Silas's distinct hand, spoke of a desire for complete unification, a merging of their two selves into a single, indivisible entity. It described increasingly desperate measures to achieve this, hinting at acts that went beyond mere observation and into the realm of physical alteration. Davies felt a growing sense of dread as he read these passages. The twins' experiment with Thomas now seemed less like a detached scientific inquiry and more like a desperate attempt to validate their twisted worldview. He also found several passages where the twins discussed the possibility of one ceasing to be, of oneself being subsumed entirely by the other. These entries were particularly chilling, suggesting a potential struggle for dominance within their shared delusion. Could Elias's statement about Silas being gone be interpreted literally? Had their desperate attempts at unification resulted in the psychological or even physical erasure of one of them? Davies knew he needed more information. He decided to seek the opinion of a medical professional, someone with expertise in psychology and unusual mental states. He approached Dr. Alistair Reed, a respected physician known for his progressive views on mental illness. Davies presented him with the details of the Marrow case, carefully omitting any information that might compromise the ongoing police investigation. He focused instead on the twins' bizarre beliefs and Elias's unsettling pronouncements. Dr. Reed listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. The concept of a shared identity, particularly in the context of identical twins, is not entirely unheard of, he explained. There have been cases where twins exhibit an exceptionally strong empathetic connection, even a sense of shared experience. However, the level of delusion and the violent actions in this case are deeply concerning. He paused, stroking his beard. The idea of a dominant and subservient self within a shared delusion is also interesting. It suggests a potential power dynamic, a struggle for control within their internal world. Mr. Elias's statement about his brother being gone could be a manifestation of this. Perhaps in his mind, the dominant self has somehow extinguished the other. Dr. Reed cautioned Davies against taking Elias's words at face value, noting that they could be a symptom of his disturbed mental state. However, he agreed that the case warranted further investigation, particularly into the nature of the twins' relationship and their shared beliefs. Leaving Dr. Reed's office, Davies felt a renewed sense of purpose. The puzzle of the Marrow twins was far from solved. The horrifying events in their home might have been just the surface of a much deeper and more unsettling truth. He knew he had to find out what Elias meant when he said Silas was gone. Was it a metaphorical statement? A descent into deeper madness? Or was it something far more literal, a chilling consequence of their desperate attempt to become one? The answers, Davies suspected, lay hidden within the twisted depths of the Marrow twins' shared delusion. And he was determined to uncover them, no matter how dark or disturbing they might be. Davies's pursuit of the truth led him back to the Bethlehem Royal Hospital. This time, he requested to see Silas. To his surprise, the request was granted. Perhaps the authorities believed Silas had become more lucid, or perhaps they simply saw no further harm in allowing a brief interview. Silas was confined to a separate, more secure room than Elias. He sat rigidly on a cot, his gaze sharp and alert, a stark contrast to Elias's vacant stare. There was a palpable intensity about him, a coiled energy that Davies found both unnerving and intriguing. "Officer Davies," Silas said, his voice cold and measured, betraying no hint of madness. "I remember you." "Mr. Marrow," Davies replied, keeping his tone neutral. "I have some questions I hope you can answer." Silas's lips curved into a sardonic smile. "Questions, like everyone else. They want to understand. They want to dissect, but they will never comprehend the truth of our connection." "Your brother says you are gone," Davies stated directly, watching Silas's reaction closely. A flicker of something, pain, anger, crossed Silas's face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Elias always was the more dramatic one," he said dismissively, lost in his own internal landscape. "He seemed to believe it," Davies pressed. "He spoke of it with conviction." "Conviction is not always synonymous with reality, officer," Silas retorted, "especially when dealing with matters of the mind." Davies shifted his approach. "In your writings, you and Elias discussed a dominant and subservient self. Could you elaborate on that?" Silas's eyes narrowed. "Those were theoretical explorations, officer. Attempts to articulate the complexities of our bond. But you also wrote about a desire for complete unification, for one self to subsume the other," Davies continued, his voice steady. A long silence hung in the air. Silas's gaze became distant, as if he were looking inward. "The merging of two into one. It is a powerful concept, is it not?" to transcend the limitations of individuality, to achieve a true singularity. "And did you achieve that?" Davies asked carefully. Silas's smile returned, this time with a hint of something unsettlingly triumphant. "We came close, officer. Closer than you can possibly imagine." Davies felt a chill run down his spine. "What happened, Mr. Marrow?" Silas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There can only be one, officer. In the end, there can only be one." His words were chillingly ambiguous. Did he mean that one of their selves had become dominant, effectively silencing the other, or had something more drastic occurred? Davies decided to try a different tack. "Tell me about your experiments, Mr. Marrow. What were you hoping to achieve with Thomas?" Silas's eyes lit up with a disturbing intensity. "We sought to prove the interconnectedness of consciousness, the shared experience of sensation. Thomas was a catalyst. We believed that by inflicting pain on one vessel, the other would feel it, a testament to our profound link." "And did you feel it?" Davies asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Silas hesitated for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice low and resonant. "We both felt it." Davies found himself struggling to reconcile Silas's seemingly rational demeanor with the horrifying acts he had committed. Was he truly delusional, or was there a twisted logic to his beliefs? He asked about the bloodstain in the downstairs room, but Silas dismissed it as a preliminary exploration, a crude attempt to understand the physical manifestations of their connection. As their time drew to a close, Davies returned to Elias's statement. "Mr. Silas, your brother believes you are gone. What would you say to him?" Silas's gaze hardened. "I would tell him that he is mistaken. I am here. I have always been here, and I will always be here." His words, while seemingly a denial of Elias's statement, carried a chilling undertone. They sounded less like a reassurance and more like a possessive claim. Leaving Silas's presence, Davies felt a profound sense of unease. He had gleaned more information, but the truth remained elusive, shrouded in the twins' twisted perception of reality. He couldn't shake the feeling that Silas's seemingly lucid demeanor was a carefully constructed facade, masking a deeper, more disturbing truth. And Elias's vacant pronouncements might hold a key to understanding the true horror of the Marrow Twins' dreadful history. Please subscribe to the channel for the next chapter of the dreadful history of the Marrow Twins. This is a work of fiction. Davies's interviews with the Marrow Twins left him with more questions than answers. Silas's chilling pronouncements and Elias's vacant despair painted a disturbing picture of a relationship warped by a shared delusion. The concept of a dominant and subservient self, hinted at in their writings and subtly suggested by their individual behaviors, began to take on a more sinister significance in Davies's mind. He revisited the excerpts from their journals, focusing on the passages discussing unification and the potential for one self to be subsumed by the other. He noticed a shift in tone over time. Early entries spoke of a collaborative exploration, a shared journey into the depths of their interconnectedness. But later entries, particularly those believed to be written by Silas, exhibited a growing sense of control and a desire for a more complete merging, often at the expense of Elias's individuality. One passage, scrawled in hurried handwriting and signed with a barely legible S, read, "The vessel resists. The weaker self clings to its fragile autonomy, but the union is inevitable. The singularity awaits." Another entry, believed to be Elias's, was filled with fragmented sentences expressing confusion and a sense of fading identity. "I am becoming less. The edges blur. Is it me or him?" These writings, combined with their contrasting demeanors in the hospital, strongly suggested a power imbalance within their shared delusion. Silas appeared to be the dominant force, the one driving their increasingly dangerous experiments, while Elias seemed to be fading, his sense of self eroding under the weight of their twisted beliefs. Davies began to suspect that Elias's statement about Silas being gone might not have been a reflection of Silas's physical absence, but rather a metaphorical acknowledgement of his own diminishing presence within their shared consciousness. Perhaps in Elias's mind, Silas had become so dominant that his own sense of self had been effectively extinguished. But if that were the case, why did Silas deny it so vehemently? His insistence that he was always here had a possessive, almost predatory quality to it. Davies considered the possibility that their unification had taken a more literal and horrifying turn. Could one twin have physically harmed the other in a desperate attempt to achieve their twisted ideal of singularity? The bloodstain in the downstairs room took on a new, more ominous meaning. He decided to press the authorities for a more thorough investigation of the twins' home. He emphasized the need to search for any evidence of physical violence beyond what had been inflicted on Thomas, any indication that one twin might have been harmed by the other. The subsequent search yielded nothing conclusive. The house was meticulously clean, any traces of their experiments seemingly erased. However, Davies noticed a locked room in the basement that the police had been unable to access. Obtaining a warrant to force entry took several days. When the door was finally breached, the scene inside sent a wave of nausea through Davies and the other officers. The room was dimly lit by a single bare bulb and contained a makeshift operating table stained with old blood. Various surgical tools lay scattered across a nearby bench, alongside strange, handwritten notes detailing disturbing anatomical theories. In the center of the room, secured to the operating table, was a heavily bandaged figure. As the officers cautiously approached, a faint moan escaped from beneath the bandages. They carefully unwrapped the figure, revealing a person whose features were shockingly disfigured. It was impossible to immediately identify their gender or their identity. Crude surgical stitches crisscrossed their face and body, suggesting a horrific and amateurish attempt at alteration. Davies felt a cold dread grip his heart. Could this be the result of the Marrow Twins' desperate quest for unification? Had they attempted to physically merge themselves? The figure was still alive, though barely conscious. A doctor was immediately summoned. While they waited, Davies noticed a small, tarnished locket clutched tightly in the figure's hand. He gently pried it open, revealing two miniature portraits, identical images of Elias and Silas Marrow as young boys. The discovery sent a jolt of understanding through Davies. The disfigured figure on the table was one of the twins. But which one? And what unspeakable act had the other committed? The arrival of the doctor confirmed Davies's worst fears. The injuries were consistent with crude surgical attempts to alter the individual's physical appearance. It was impossible to say for certain which twin it was, but the doctor noted that the underlying bone structure suggested it was likely Elias. Elias, who had spoken of Silas being gone, had perhaps been the victim of Silas's twisted desire for unification. Had Silas attempted to physically transform Elias, to somehow merge their two beings into one? The realization was horrifying. The Marrow Twins' experiment had not been limited to psychological manipulation and the torture of a stranger. It had culminated in a brutal act of self-mutilation, a desperate and insane attempt to fulfill their delusional vision. The question remained, where was Silas? If the figure on the table was indeed Elias, what had become of his twin? Had he fled? Was he still at large, a dangerous madman capable of further atrocities? Davies knew his investigation was far from over. The dreadful history of the Marrow Twins had taken a dark and unexpected turn, and the final chapter was yet to be written. The discovery in the basement sent shockwaves through the authorities. The disfigured figure, tentatively identified as Elias Marrow, was rushed to a secure medical facility. The extent of his physical and psychological trauma was profound, leaving doctors uncertain of his chances of recovery, both physical and mental. A manhunt was immediately launched for Silas Marrow. His escape was now considered a significant threat to public safety. Descriptions of him were circulated widely, and police scoured the city, revisiting known associates and lodging houses. Davies, though officially relieved of the case, found himself unable to let go. The image of the bandaged figure on the operating table clutching the locket with the twins' childhood portraits haunted his waking hours. He felt a deep-seated need to understand the full extent of their tragic and terrifying story. He returned to the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, hoping for any further insight from Elias, despite the doctor's warnings about his fragile mental state. Elias remained largely unresponsive, lost in a world of his own. However, during one brief moment of lucidity, he whispered a single chilling word: mirror. The word echoed in Davies' mind. Mirror. What could it mean? Was it a clue, a symbolic reference to their identical appearance, or something more literal? He mulled over the word, trying to connect it to the horrifying scene in the basement. He recalled an unsettling observation from the initial encounter: the twins' uncanny synchronicity. They moved, spoke, and even reacted as if they were a single entity. It was as if they were constantly reflecting each other, mirroring every gesture and thought. Davies decided to revisit the twins' journals, the ones he had previously accessed. He focused on any mention of mirrors or reflections. He found a disturbing passage in Silas's handwriting. The mirror reveals the illusion. Two forms, but one true self. We will shatter the reflection to reveal the singular truth. This passage, combined with Elias's whispered word, sparked a horrifying realization in Davies's mind. What if Silas hadn't just attempted to physically alter Elias, but to become Elias? To erase one identity and assume both, believing that this grotesque transformation would finally achieve their delusional singularity. The more he considered it, the more chillingly plausible it seemed. Silas, the dominant force, driven by a fanatical desire for unification, could have inflicted the horrific injuries on Elias, not just to merge them, but to eliminate Elias's distinct identity and step into his place. But if that were the case, where was the real Silas? If Elias was the one disfigured, then Silas must be at large, perhaps masquerading as his brother. The implications were terrifying. Davies immediately contacted Scotland Yard with his new theory. The idea that Silas could be impersonating Elias, or that his disappearance was part of a larger, more sinister plan, was initially met with skepticism. However, Davies's persistent and detailed arguments, backed by the evidence from the basement and the twins' unsettling writings, eventually convinced his superiors to take the theory seriously. The search for Silas intensified, but with a new directive: to consider the possibility that he might not look like Silas Marrow. He might, in fact, look like Elias Marrow. A new wave of unease spread through London. The idea that a madman capable of such unspeakable acts could be walking among them, disguised as his own victim, was a chilling prospect. Davies felt a renewed sense of urgency. The time was running out. Silas, if he truly believed he had achieved singularity, would be even more dangerous, his delusion reinforced by his horrific actions. He remembered Silas's chilling words during their interview. There can only be one officer. In the end, there can only be one. At the time, Davies had interpreted it as a statement of power struggle. Now it took on a much darker, literal meaning. Silas hadn't just wanted to dominate Elias. He wanted to replace him. The fog continued to cling to London, its cold embrace mirroring the deepening mystery. The dreadful history of the Marrow Twins, it seemed, was far from its end. The true horror was still lurking, hidden in plain sight, waiting to reveal itself. Davies knew he had to find Silas before the madman could complete his twisted transformation. The fog was thicker than ever, a suffocating blanket that swallowed sound and blurred vision. News of the disfigured twin and the disturbing new theory had sent a ripple of quiet panic through London. The city was a labyrinth of shadows, and the thought of Silas Marrow, a man who might now wear his brother's face, lurking within it, was a chilling prospect. Officer Davies, driven by a relentless sense of urgency, felt the weight of the city's unease. He had exhausted every traditional avenue of investigation. The official manhunt continued, but without a definitive lead. It was a slow, methodical search through a sprawling metropolis. Davies needed a different approach, a way to anticipate the movements of a man whose sanity was irrevocably twisted. He returned to the Marrow Twins' house on Dorset Street, the place where the horror had begun. The police seals were still on the door, but he felt an almost magnetic pull to the decaying brickwork. He stood outside, listening to the silence of the street, trying to imagine the twisted logic that had governed the lives within. Davies thought of Elias's whispered word, mirror. He thought of Silas's chilling pronouncements, there can only be one. And he thought of the macabre surgical attempts in the basement. It wasn't just about becoming one. It was about the elimination of the other, a grotesque act of self-preservation within a shared delusion. He remembered an obscure passage in Silas's journal, one he had initially dismissed as metaphorical ramblings. The true self seeks its reflection. Where the image is clearest, there the essence resides. Davies stared at the dark, silent windows of the house. Where the image is clearest, where would Silas, consumed by the delusion of being a single, unified entity, go to find his reflection, his confirmation of his new, singular identity? A sudden, chilling thought struck him. The Bethlehem Royal Hospital. It was the only place where both twins had been. The place where Elias, his face now a raw testament to Silas's madness, lay unconscious. Silas, in his twisted mind, might view Elias as the ultimate mirror, the final canvas for his grotesque masterpiece of unification. Davies immediately hailed a cab, the urgency in his voice convincing the wary driver to brave the intensifying fog. The journey to Bethlehem was agonizingly slow, the gas lamps offering little comfort against the encroaching darkness. When he arrived, the hospital grounds were eerily quiet, the fog muffling the usual sounds of the city. He rushed inside, his heart pounding. He explained his theory to the startled superintendent, whose initial skepticism turned to alarm as Davies recounted the basement discovery and Elias's whispered word. They moved quickly towards the secure ward where Elias was recovering. The air grew colder with every step, a familiar chill that Davies recognized from the twins' house. As they approached Elias's room, they heard a faint, rhythmic scraping sound emanating from within. It was subtle, almost imperceptible over the muffled hum of the hospital, but it sent a shiver down Davies's spine. The door was slightly ajar. Davies pushed it open cautiously. The scene inside was horrifying. Silas Marrow stood over Elias's bed, his back to them, his movements precise and deliberate. In his hand, he held a small, sharp shard of glass, presumably from a broken mirror. He was meticulously, almost artistically, carving delicate, grotesque lines onto Elias's already disfigured face. Silas hummed a tuneless, unnerving melody as he worked, completely engrossed. The faint light from the window caught the glint of the glass shard as he etched deeper into Elias's flesh. "Silas!" Davies roared, his voice cutting through the thick silence of the room. Silas froze, his hand still poised over Elias's face. He turned slowly, his eyes wild and unblinking. His face, though still undeniably Silas's, bore a chilling resemblance to the disfigured features of Elias, as if he were trying to wear his brother's trauma. "Officer," Silas said, his voice a low, triumphant whisper. "You're just in time. The final brushstroke, the ultimate reflection." He gestured towards Elias. He tried to resist, but I showed him. There is only one face, officer. Only one true self. Davies saw the madness in Silas's eyes, a profound and terrifying conviction that he was merely completing a work of art, shaping his own identity through the defilement of his twin. Silas lunged, not at Davies, but at a large mirror on the opposite wall, his intention clearly to shatter it and perhaps use more shards. Davies, anticipating the move, tackled him, bringing him to the ground. A desperate struggle ensued. Silas, fueled by his warped delusion, fought with unexpected strength. He clawed and bit, his eyes fixed on Davies with a chilling intensity. But Davies, knowing the full extent of the horror Silas was capable of, fought with a desperate resolve. Finally, with the help of the superintendent and arriving orderlies, Silas was subdued, his limbs tightly bound. He thrashed and screamed, his cries echoing through the silent hospital corridor. "We are one. You can't separate us. He is me." As Silas was dragged away, his eyes locked onto Davies, a final chilling stare. Davies looked at Elias, lying still and broken on the bed, his face a canvas of unspeakable suffering. The locket still clutched in his hand. The dreadful history of the Marrow Twins had reached its terrifying conclusion. Not with the discovery of a lost twin, but with the revelation of a mind so consumed by its own twisted logic that it sought to literally erase one identity to solidify another. Silas Marrow, in his insane quest for singularity, had not just claimed to be the same person as his twin. He had tried to make it a horrifying reality. The fog outside seemed to recede, but the chilling shadow of the Marrow Twins story would forever linger in the memory of London. Please subscribe to the channel for the next thrilling story. This is a work of fiction,